you're going to vote, and whatever you vote for, that's what we're going to do. So we got option A and option B. Option A is the advertised topic. It's called The Sources of American Conduct. And the aim of that lecture is to describe why we do what we do in the world, in simple terms. So lecture A, why we do what we do in the world, is called The Sources of American Conduct. Option B is called The Revisionist Imperative, Rethinking 20th Century Wars. And option B is a little bit more difficult for me to explain, but in essence, option B says this: the history that we think we know, the history that we have internalized, is inadequate to the present and will prove to be even more inadequate to the future. And therefore, there is a need for us to reconceive our history, particularly the history of the 20th century, to come up with a new story to either complement or replace the old story. And so lecture B describes, that lays out that argument for you. All right? A, B. All those in favor of A, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have about 25. Option B, raise your hand. It's B.
Hanging chat. They're hanging chat.
Recount.
No recount. So, and I think this is going to take about 40 minutes, and that should allow us considerable time for discussion. So let me just hop into this. Not long before his untimely death, the historian Tony Judd observed that, quote, "For many American commentators and policymakers, the message of the 20th century is that war works." I think Judd might have gone even further. Well beyond the circle of experts and insiders, many ordinary Americans, at least tacitly, share that view. Now, this reading of the 20th century has had profound implications for U.S. policy for the 21st century. With the possible exception of Israel, the United States today is the only developed nation in which belief in war's efficacy continues to enjoy widespread acceptance. Others, the citizens of Great Britain and France, of Germany and Japan, took from the 20th century a different lesson. War devastates. It impoverishes. It coarsens. Even when seemingly necessary or justified, it entails brutality, barbarism, and the killing of innocents. To choose war, they believe, is to leap into the dark, entrusting the nation's fate to forces beyond human control. Americans persist in believing otherwise. That belief manifests itself in a number of ways, not least in a pronounced willingness to invest in, maintain, and employ military power. I should emphasize that this belief that war works has not made soldiering per se a popular vocation. Americans prefer war as a spectator sport rather than as a participatory one. Why do Americans cling to the belief in war that other advanced nations have long since abandoned? The simple answer is that for a time, war did work, or seemed to anyway, at least for the United States, even if not for others. After all, the vast conflagration that we remember not altogether appropriately as World War II vaulted the United States to the very summit of global power. The onset of that conflict found Americans still struggling to cope with a decade-long economic crisis. Recall that the unemployment rate in 1939 was several percentage points above the highest point it has reached during our own Great Recession. Notwithstanding the palliative effects of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the long-term viability of liberal democratic capitalism remained then an open question. Other ideological claimants on the far left and far right were advancing a strong case that they define the future. By 1945, however, when that conflict ended, almost all of that had changed. At home, war restored economic prosperity and set the stage for a decades-long boom. At least as important, the war reinvigorated confidence in American institutions. The challenges of war management had prodded Washington to get its act together. Prodigious feats of production in places like Cleveland and Detroit and Pittsburgh had enabled the United States to raise vast air, sea, and naval forces, which had then employed on a global scale with considerable effectiveness. The American way of war implied a remarkable knack for doing big things in a big way, sweeping aside whatever obstacles might stand in the way. The bumptious wartime motto of the Army Corps of Engineers testified to this approach. The difficult we do at once, that motto went. The impossible takes a little longer. This wasn't empty bluster. The Manhattan Project, culminating in the development of the atomic bomb, testified to American technical prowess, but also implied broader claims of superiority. The United States was once again a country that did big things, really big things, that no other country could do. Meanwhile, with the gross domestic product doubling in barely a half-decade, during the war years, the GDP doubled. The United States had become an economic, technological, political, military, and cultural juggernaut without peer. The American way of life, once again, signified levels of material abundance that made Americans the envy of the world. This was the America into which I was born in 1947. I breathed in the war's vapors, which lingered long after the war itself had ended. Both of my parents had served. My father, a signalman on a destroyer escort in the Atlantic, my mother, an Army nurse in the Pacific. For them, as for countless others, the war shaped perceptions of past and present. It shaped as well their expectations for the future and their understanding of the dangers and opportunities that lay ahead. How well I remember as a young boy growing up in Chicago watching Victory at Sea on television, with that stirring score by Richard Rodgers, the documentary series narrated by Leonard Graves, who, as the theme music faded, began each episode by announcing in a stentorian voice, "And now." Here was history. Gripping, heroic, immediate, filled with high drama. Here, too, was the cornerstone of a grand narrative constructed around the momentous events of 1939-1945, with special emphasis on those in which the United States had played a notable hand. I couldn't get enough of it. The history I absorbed then and carried into adulthood, the story that really mattered, divided into three distinctive chapters. The tale commenced with a prelude, recounting the events of a so-called pre-war era, a period of fecklessness and folly, even if for a youngster the details tended to be a bit vague. The tale concluded with what Americans were calling the post-war era, unfolding in the war's shadows, its course to be determined by how well the nation had absorbed the war's self-evident lessons. But constituting the heart of the story was the war itself, A slumbering America brutally awakened, rising up in righteous anger, smiting evildoers, and thereby saving the world. One might say that the account I imbibe adhered closely to Winston Churchill's, albeit shorn of any British accent. Thanks in no small part to Churchill, although not he alone, the war became, in Tony Judd's words, a moral memory palace, a source of compelling, instantly recognizable parables.